Let's bring in the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Congressman, thanks for being with us this morning. You were in the room. You were part of these meetings. Take us inside and help us understand the question we've been trying to answer all morning, which is that you have Republicans like Lindsey Graham and Senator Lankford over on the Senate side, not exactly liberal squishes, saying to the House, this is the best deal we're going to get. It's the best deal that's come along in a long time. Frankly, it's a little bit more friendly to the conservative side of the argument. Take the deal, Speaker Johnson. Take the deal, House Republicans. So why aren't they taking the deal?
Yeah, well, Willie, it was a remarkable hour and a half in the cabinet room with the president and with about 20 members of Congress in the Senate. And I'll tell you, for an hour and a half, everybody couldn't have agreed more. We were violently agreeing with each other on the urgency of funding Ukraine. And, by the way, I heard the president at least 2 or 3 times say, I will do a big border deal. So, I mean, I used to negotiate in the private sector. This is a deal ripe to happen. And so what is about to happen is as clear as day. The Senate is going to pass a bill, and it will be the first immigration border bill, in decades. And by the way, as Lindsey Graham said, and as Republican leader Mitch McConnell said, it is a better deal than you will get if you own the House and the Senate and the White House, the Republicans. And then one man makes a fascinating and hugely consequential decision, and that man is Speaker Johnson. Because here's why: there is a huge majority in the House for that deal. I know it. At least half of the Republicans and probably close to all of the Democrats. And so Johnson says, I can either get something done on Ukraine, which everybody, not everybody, but most people, the vast majority of people say is important. We can get a historic border deal done, or I can piss off Marjorie Taylor Greene or, the Heritage Foundation or Donald Trump, in which case I may lose my job. I don't think I've ever seen a moment working here in which the trade-off between the good, not just to the United States with a border deal, but to the world and the Western alliance, hangs on the fate of one man to decide whether he is going to put all of that ahead of his own political survival.
So, Congressman, I know that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, other top national security figures have walked through the need to support Ukraine ASAP and what would happen if the United States doesn't. Give us your fears, if you will. If this deal does fall through, if the speaker decides he can't get this done, if he is too concerned, as you say, about hanging on to his own job, what do you think the repercussions would be in Eastern Europe and beyond?
Right. Well, the way that plays out is a week or two from now, Johnson says, well, the Democrats and the president wouldn't go far enough on immigration. And that will be him caving, and he won't say it, but that'll be him caving to Marjorie Taylor Greene and to Donald Trump and to a minority of Republican members in the House. Here's what happens next. Over time, not overnight, but over time, Putin makes progress in Ukraine. I don't know if that means that he takes the country or if he just takes a lot more of the country. President Xi in China sees that, and the lesson for President Xi is that the Americans can be counted upon to be tough for about 6 months, and then they go away. And what does he think with respect to Taiwan? Terrible lesson learned for President Xi. The Iranians, who are present, who are right now destabilizing the world, see a lesson in how the United States cuts and runs when things get tough. So if Speaker Johnson chooses to walk away from this with no border, no immigration deal, and nothing for Ukraine, we live in a fabulously more dangerous world, including, by the way, and I'm willing to acknowledge to Republicans that having uncontrolled flows of people into this country is a national security risk. So if Johnson chooses that path, we live in a much more dangerous world and a much more dangerous country.
So, Congressman, whether you like it or not, you're kind of representative of a specific type member of the House of Representatives. I mean, you got a pretty good job in the private sector, and then suddenly one day you decide, hey, maybe I could bring something to the country by representing my congressional district in Washington. And you run for Congress and you win, and you have brought several things to the country in terms of representation. But now you're sitting there, and you're part of a Congress that is worse than being dysfunctional. You're part of a Congress where the majority party, slim majority, is now an obstacle to getting anything done at all. How does that make you feel about your choices to run for Congress and be a member of Congress?
I will tell you this, even in the worst moments, it is an honor and a privilege, and I thank my voters every day for putting the trust in me that they do, particularly at these very, very dangerous times. And let's be clear, this isn't necessarily a matter of backgrounds. There are some people here who are here perhaps for different reasons, to be famous on social media. But the one thing I would point out to you, what's different today? What causes Marjorie Taylor Greene to say that she will file a motion to vacate against the Speaker if he moves on Ukraine? The answer is Donald Trump. And we could spend 2 hours talking about what Donald Trump did or didn't do, but I think that even his most fervent supporters would say that Donald Trump is largely out for Donald Trump, right? And so as Donald Trump looks at the Ukraine border deal, do you think he's actually weighing the nuances of, aid to Ukraine and timing and exactly how parole and, border security should be run? Of course not. He's trying to advance his own personal interests and, frankly, the own possibilities of his own re-election. And I would just hope, love him or hate him, that you understand where his fundamental interests lie. They do not lie with the national security of the United States or the preservation of Ukraine or keeping China out of Taiwan. They lie very plainly with himself.
Many of your colleagues, Congressman, have said the same thing about the risks around Ukraine. I mean, even to the extent that Japan perhaps might decide that it needs its own nuclear armory in order, because the American nuclear security umbrella seems to have holes in it if America abandons Ukraine. But how, when it comes to the election campaign, how will Democrats be able to counter the message from those Republicans who are blocking this bill that Democrats are just soft on immigration? I mean, I hear what you're saying. We read the details of the bill. It is a tough bill, as Lindsey Graham says, the toughest that Republicans could hope to get. But I can see it still being spun as the Democrats were the ones who wouldn't go further on immigration, and that's why America abandoned Ukraine.
Well, first of all, let's remember who decided to link the two. Right? We could just be voting on Ukraine right now, and it would pass. But the Republican Speaker, driven largely, I think, by his, fire-breathing fringe, and Donald Trump, said, we're going to link these two things. That opens the possibility that you get neither. You get neither Ukraine nor border. Secondly, I would say, and again, I'll say what I said at the start of this, I heard the President of the United States at least 3 times yesterday say, I will do a big border deal. I heard Chuck Schumer say, I'm a New Yorker. New Yorker has a problem with people coming into the city. The Democratic willingness is absolutely there, including, by the way, to probably stretch in ways that will cause the president to take some fire from the progressive wing for people who are very pro-immigration. The willingness is there, and there should be no doubt about if this is kiboshed. It wasn't because there wasn't a broad support for a deal. It was because the Speaker chose, forced by a number of his members, to kowtow to the most extreme element of his party.
I mean, the president and Lindsey Graham can agree on this. So
and Mitch
that
McConnell
should tell you something.
And John Thune and Mike Turner.
Yes.
I mean, I could stand here for an hour and list people who are desperate to get this deal done. And by the way, those are people, interestingly enough, if you looked at the list of people who are saying, by God, do this deal, maybe with the exception of Lindsey Graham, that list is of Republicans who have maintained some sense of themselves and their ideology and the history of their party going back to Reagan, in contrast to the chaos and self-servingness of the MAGA fringe here.
Ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut, thank you very much for being on this morning.